I want you to imagine that you just finished a session game mastering your TTRPG of choice. The players just barely survived a harrowing encounter. There was a real threat that one of the player characters was going to die, and that player was going to lose their ability to continue playing them in the game's story. Now, everyone is packing up and leaving. As far as they know, you're picking up plates and glasses, putting away all of your intricate minis that you bought special for this night in order to really immerse your players. I want you to imagine that you can hear what they're saying if they don't believe that you're in the room. I like to imagine kind of like a Scooby-Doo scenario where you're behind a painting with the eyes cut out or something. For real, what do you think that they would say? Would they say, "Man, that monster was really tough. It was really unfair how many legendary resistances it had"? Would they say something like, "Thanks for that healing word, that was a really clutch move"? Or, "I'm really glad our characters got to know each other"? Now, probably more importantly for today, what would you want them to say? And what does that tell you about your priorities as a game master? Hi, I'm John from Incendium RPGs, and today we're talking about a specific GM philosophy, which is invisible GMing. I have a feeling there are going to be a lot of you out there that disagree with a lot of the points that I make, and I'm really interested in hearing your thoughts, so make sure to comment them down below. So, let's get into it. Alright, it's that time again, everybody, for the subscriber roll-off! Yes! Yes! I'm going to use my influence action, and we're going to roll contested d20s. If my roll meets or beats yours, I've succeeded on influencing you to subscribe to our channel and hitting the notification bell. Let's go! Solid 9. Well, statistically, that's going to be less than half of you, but those of you that did subscribe, welcome to the channel. During my sophomore and junior year in college, I was convinced that the field I wanted to pursue was video game design and development. My university had just created this new digital media department, and I was taking classes in game design, animation, and video editing. My video editing professor in particular dropped a pearl of wisdom that I hold on to this day, which is that you know an editor is doing their job well if you don't notice their editing. Think about it. When you watch an awesome movie and you come out of the theater, unless you're part of the industry, it's highly unlikely you're going to hear anybody praise the movie was well edited. They may compliment the special effects, or the acting, or the dialogue. They may have certain jokes that they find memorable, or quotes that hit a little deep. But no one's sitting there going, "Wow, that jump cut, that really made it." The only time someone really notices editing is when it's awkward, because the role of the editor is to create seamless transitions that immerse the viewer into the story. They are the true unsung heroes of Hollywood. Invisible GMing, the school of thought we're studying today, follows the same core philosophy. A game master is doing their role best when their role is invisible to the experience of the players. Obviously, TTRPGs are a different medium than film or television. The GM themselves is a player and are embodying a huge amount of the world elements that the players are interacting with. Let me give an example, one that I've heard a lot of game masters express that they want. One player character, a bard, is processing new information that's come to light. While she's trying to open herself up emotionally, usually being introverted and closed-guarded, she found out that one of her mentors, an NPC in the story, died without her being there. Another character, a barbarian, enters the scene. Not being the most diplomatic or nuanced speaker, the barbarian does try to reach out to console the bard, but preferring to grieve alone and not wanting to feel vulnerable, the bard pulls away. This leads to the barbarian asking, "Why do you always do this?" and the bard lashing out. There's an in-character argument that ends with the bard slipping out of the room to save face. Afterwards, the bard reflects and realizes that she didn't handle the situation well, and makes a note to reach out to the barbarian later once she's cooled off. The players, behind the characters, are emotionally fine with each other the whole time, but both of their characters have continued their emotional development. In this exchange, there is no need for the GM to insert themselves at all. All they have to do is sit back and let the two characters do their thing. Now, that being said, even though the GM is invisible in this interaction, that doesn't mean that they don't have a role to play. After all, this PC to PC interaction would not have happened if the GM did not construct an environment where both players felt comfortable exploring this kind of emotionally vulnerable exchange. Let's pause the TTRPG lens for a second, and let's go back to our TV movie comparison. I think if a lot of GMs were honest with themselves, the way that they would view themselves in relation to their players is that they would be kind of the director/writer, while their players would be actors in the story they're constructing. The GM has a particular vision for their campaign, and their players are actors participating in the story. In the most egregious railroady setup, the GM would have this pre-written scenario, and they expect their players or actors to go along with this script. Sure, the players aren't literally reading lines off a page, but the expectation a lot of GMs start with is that they'll create a narrow set of events, a chain of scenes, and the players will just go along with it. One of my personal pastimes these past few years has been listening to a bunch of rewatch podcasts. Office Ladies, It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia podcast. And one of the things those podcasters talk about is how on a lot of shows, there's tension between the writer and the actors. The writer wants lines delivered word for word, whereas actors trying to emotionally embody their characters want a little more freedom in exploring the dimensions of their personality. From my experience of playing and GMing in these railroady type games that I mentioned earlier, the tension sounds exactly the same. The players want to break free and explore. The GM wants to keep the plot moving. GMs with a fair amount of skill tend to view this relationship differently. Rather than a writer that's constructed this plot, instead they see themselves as, say, a director of an improv show, and their players are improv actors. In this model, the GM views the actors as the true stars, as opposed to the vehicles to deliver their preconceived vision. The director also gets to play as well. They're also an improv actor, getting to embody the various NPCs of the story. In fact, I can't think of any good TTRPG session that I've been a part of or heard about that doesn't at least start with this kind of dynamic. After all, every game has to start somewhere, right? Now, as you may guess from how I'm speaking about this, I think that you can have a lot of fun with this kind of relationship. I also don't think that it is the last form of invisible GMing. While the director improv acting dynamic can be really fun, spontaneous, memorable, one thing I've noticed is that it only goes on so long. Games that stay in that kind of relationship tend not to have a lot of longevity. In fact, even the most successful games I've heard about or experienced myself that stick with that kind of dynamic at most last between 6 months to a year. For a lot of gamers, that is the sweet spot amount of time they want to be playing the same characters. Much of the time, though, those games end up fizzling or concluding without a satisfactory resolution. Now, I don't want to come off like I'm knocking this type of game. Again, there are a lot of players and GMs I've talked to where this is their preferred mode of play. So, just to provide some contrast, what is this final form of invisible GMing I'm alluding to?
Who here's tired of my third form?
Me.
Me?
Me!
Alrighty then, final form it is.
Personally, I was a bigger fan of the first form. I'd settle on second, really.
Rather than a director/improv actor relationship, I found a lot of success viewing a GM as more a showrunner/editor and the players as actor-writers. To go back to the It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia podcast, Having listened to 3 of the stars of that show, Glenn Howerton, Rob McElhenney, Charlie Day, it's evident that one of the strengths of that show's production is that the actors are also writers in the room. To go back to the first dynamic we talked about, where the GM is more of a writer, viewing their players as simply actors to follow their script or plot, when you invite the players as actors into the writer's room, there becomes this greater level of freedom and ownership that those players have over their characters. They stop being merely reactive to whatever situation the GM presents, and they start to be proactive with their character's emotional development. They can write things down, things that they don't even necessarily share with anybody else at the table, including the GM. And by writing, I just mean thinking like a writer, as opposed to like literally writing things down. Again, if a lot of GMs were honest with themselves, really they want to be seen and heard. They want to be told what a great job they're doing, how genius their plot is, how it's so immersive, like watching Critical Role, or even something with critical acclaim, like the earlier seasons of Game of Thrones. They want to be compared to the greats. Again, seen and heard, not invisible. I don't have any judgment towards GMs that feel that way, that are GMing because they want to be seen and heard. They want to express themselves creatively. But we do have to acknowledge that that is and not to sound negative with it, a self-centered mindset. I want to tell my great story. I want to construct a world my players have fun in. It's I-based. Versus a player-centered mindset where you genuinely get the most joy if your players can go 60 or 90 minutes talking with each other where you're not saying or adding anything at all, because you know you've created an environment where your direct, acknowledged involvement is unnecessary for players to discover more about themselves and connect with each other. The reason I view this differently from the second dynamic, director of improv actors, is because a lot of times when you're playing purely reactively, you're just making a bunch of spontaneous, wacky decisions. A lot of times you don't have the space to think more deeply about your character. A lot of the deep reflection happens during in-between times. So if you don't give your characters any downtime, they have no time to reflect. And again, a lot of players don't need that deep, reflective, cathartic experience. They just want to play D&D and be silly. So to go back for a second, I had mentioned that in this last form, that the GM is more of an editor showrunner. So how is a showrunner different from a director? Well, again, let's talk about TV series. If we look at something like The Office, oftentimes the cast would be working with a different director episode to episode. Each individual director is going to have their own specific vision for a story. A showrunner, on the other hand, has a much broader view, and their role is to have overall creative authority and management responsibility. And I think the key thing there is responsibility. As a GM, as soon as you assume that role, you are the leader of your table, whether you like that or not. And you also have management responsibility for how the game is run. And oftentimes, to go back to the difference between a showrunner and director, a director is concerned with this story and their vision, whereas a showrunner has to think about more than that. Beyond the story, which a lot of GMs over-prioritize, a showrunner mindset GM is thinking of the real world experience. Are we playing on a table that's big enough to fit the map? Are we communicating through a convenient channel for everyone, like Discord or Messenger? How long are we gonna be playing for? And are we playing in an environment where it's easy to focus? To go back to the idea that nobody really walks out of, say, like a Marvel movie and goes, wow, that was brilliantly edited. If someone watches The Office for the first time, no one's gonna sit there and be like, wow, Greg Daniels did a great job as showrunner. But the more you hear about the production of a lot of these shows, the more you realize just how impactful the showrunner is, even though they are invisible to the final product. Listening to Office Ladies, it's clear that Greg Daniels as showrunner created an environment, where the actors got to act their best. The writers got to write their best. Even crafts and services was positioned to create the best culture and environment possible. Now, as the GM, you may have broad creative goals for your campaign, and that's okay. For example, do you want to run heroic fantasy or horror? Should the characters feel powerful, or should it feel like they're always scraping by? What game rules should we change, add, take away to reinforce these themes? What players should you invite that are going to make the most out of what you're trying to do, instead of trying to play against it, to be obstinate for the sake of being obstinate? As the overall creative authority, you're leading your players through an experience, and then once you create that culture, you let your writer-actors do their best work, and you make steps to maintain it as you go. Now remember, the point of editing is often to take away content that people will never see. With a TTRPG, the complication is that your audience is also the writer-actors, and they're in the editing room with you, watching you edit and take things away in real time. As a showrunner editor, you have the ability to say no. Just make sure you're saying no because you know that by removing certain content or not allowing it, you are investing in the group's greater enjoyment of a game down the line. An example of this I can draw from my own GMing experience is from my latest campaign. When I held my session 0, one of the elements that I wanted to emphasize is that while this world had magical elements, I wanted a certain grounded nature to it. I didn't want the players to just be able to expend a spell slot and work their way around a problem. To me, that removed some storytelling potential that I was interested for my players to grapple with. There was a session where the party had some overland travel to a desert, and one of the players said, well, there's just a mage in town and I'll just get a scroll of create food and water. Again, because I wanted the setting to be more grounded, I told the player, nope, there's no mage that can do that for you. And while the player was initially slightly disappointed by the fact that they couldn't cheese their way through exploration, it ended up leading to the description of the desert as a difficult to traverse environment that added to the storytelling when we got to the session. It reinforced some of the initial tone and feeling that I had expressed I wanted to reinforce at session 0. So let's circle back to my opening question. The game has just ended. What would you want your players to say as they left, knowing that you weren't there to hear them? Are you itching to hear praise about yourself? Wow, that monster description was really immersive. Wow, that storyline was really well written. Again, despite how I may have made that sound, that's not a bad thing. You just want to be clear on what you want out of a game, or more importantly, if how you're GMing is not congruent with why you're GMing in the first place. If your group really is giving you genuine praise and they're not just trying to be polite, that's a good thing. It does mean you're doing your job well. And what does it say about your GMing if instead the conversation is like this? One player says to another, thanks for reaching out to my character. I feel like I learned a lot about your character in today's session. I feel like our characters could become good friends. You know, I know that you wanted to focus on damaging the monster, but I really appreciate that you took the time to cast Cure Wounds. I'm really looking forward to see how your character's story develops in the next session. When your players are focused on the genuine human connection with each other, someone subscribed to the invisible GMing philosophy has done their job well. With invisible GMing, it's not just about you. And here's the interesting paradoxical thing. In my experience, GMs that do an awesome job of paying attention to the player experience end up receiving the most praise because the players are having the most fun. It's not about, well, I like giving these big flowery descriptions because I think that immerses my players. No, pay attention to what actually immerses your players. In fact, recently, Chris Perkins had an interview with Todd Kenrick about the new Dungeon Master's Guide. When he describes the joy of DMs just sitting back and listening, that is exactly what I'm talking about here. So all that being said, I've also found that GMs, even with the best why, oftentimes end up dissatisfied with the sessions that they run. And the fastest way of how to get really skilled at GMing is a topic for another time. Today's video was much more about your mindset and purpose in GMing and this particular philosophy. The next video I'm writing up is all about the technical skill, the nuts and bolts about running an awesome game. Until then, I want to hear what all of you have to say. What do you think of this philosophy of invisible GMing? Does it align with you and your view on the GM-player relationship? Is there something that ultimately gets lost when you move from more of a director of improv actors mindset to more of a showrunner, editor, writer, actor relationship? Let us know in the comments down below, and have an awesome day, everybody. Bye-bye now.